Hi everyone, welcome back to week 11 of Research and Information Skills. This week we're looking at research in motion, and really that's a bit of a furphy, a mirage in a sense, because really what I want to get to is looking at questioning, how we ask questions and how that then is often converted into research, as you'll find with the example I used towards the end of the lecture, and also just the nature of questioning, why we question, how we question, etc. I have to say that the format for the PowerPoint particularly, and even the content this week, is slightly different than other weeks. It's a much more fluid approach to actually delivering content. My hope is, and certainly with attending students, and I hope you guys can engage as distant students at a slightly different level than you normally do, by actively looking at and questioning the content and the things that you're reading and coming up with your own answers. Before pursuing the content, I'd simply like to, I guess, say that given that it's week 11, my hope is that you have all engaged fully with the topic you're doing for your third assignment, that you've actually begun the research, if not, a good way through the actual research, and actually starting to look at how you're going to formulate that into an answer for your third assignment. And as I've said elsewhere, there's no extensions unless there's really good cause, and we'd have to know fairly early unless there's an emergency. And that's only because of bureaucracy, etc. And I said that last week, and I'd generally like to reiterate it, so if you missed it the first week, you'll get it this week. Anyway, like I said, it's more a case that we need to have the paperwork in and marked and finalised due to demands in the system. Anyway, getting to the content for this week. If you have a look at the session outline, I'm looking at things like asking questions, and in a sense, certainly with the attending students, I will be asking, okay, what are the principal questions you ask day to day? I mean, we ask questions all the time. In fact, moment to moment we ask questions. However, what are some of the questions that bug you? In other words, things that don't have satisfactory answers, or they have moving or shifting answers, and how do you deal with that particular thing, or that particular question, I should say. And sometimes, and I do believe this, that maybe there's lifelong questions, that maybe there never is an answer. Maybe they're context driven. Maybe they have an answer at one time in history, and then that answer's not appropriate as you move in to your lifespan, so to speak. So an answer that may have been okay when you're a teenager may not be the same when you're 50 years old, and I'd be surprised if they are. The most basic question is, why do we ask questions in the first place? Now, I've suggested on slide 3 that we ask questions principally to clarify information and instructions, and more intrinsic to ourselves. Sorry about that, I do apologise. I thought the phone was off the hook, and obviously it wasn't, so please accept my apologies. Is there anything worse? Probably not, but anyway, hopefully you'll forgive me. Anyway, back to the point. So we were looking at slide 3, and we're looking at questions and why we actually ask questions. And for me personally, probably from a young age, it was to discover the truth. So if you look at that slide, there's lots of other reasons why we ask questions, but the fact is, discover truth, and that can be a fairly, arcane, almost mysterious thing at times when you're asking bigger questions about kind of life and about purpose, and about why do you exist, etc. And they're questions I've asked from a fairly young age. Have yet to come up with any satisfactory answers. So if you're looking, good luck, because I'm still looking as well, and I'm nearly 50. But getting back to the point, so we do it to increase our personal knowledge, and sometimes this is our knowledge in a context in terms of where we work, possibly in an educational setting, or elsewhere. It could be vocational. Also, I think sometimes we ask questions of people who are suggesting things to us, and we challenge their assumptions or the errors in their thinking or in their arguments, for instance. Also, at a much more basic level, we ask questions about curiosity. I'm kind of interested in questions like, why is the sky blue? I kind of know the answer to that, or parts of the answers to that, but I'm kind of intrigued by questions that I guess are taken for granted. And the other thing is the bottom one, to explore meaning, and I mean that on every level. I don't think there's ever a time in our lives where something, there's things that occur in our lives that we don't quite understand, and we attempt to find meaning in some of the actions of other people, or things that happen to ourselves. And to give you an example, we have lots of different explanations for natural disasters, for instance, and I'm intrigued about how each one of those explanations are an attempt to create meaning in a situation that often has no meaning, really. It geological thing around earthquakes, for instance, but people overlay that with things like religious meaning, for instance, and spiritual meaning, etc. And I'm not sure about any of those answers, although I have examined them. But intriguingly enough, like I said, we can posit meaning in almost anything. A much more systemised way of asking questions, if you'll have a look on slide 4, is Bloom's taxonomy. And I haven't got time to really explore that here. I'll simply leave that as a slide for you to look at and to hopefully to digest. It's a common thread that is in education and certainly in teaching. So if any of you decide to go through education, become teachers, you'll become extremely familiar with Bloom's work. And I think personally, I think it's a great construct to use in terms of actually the elevation or the levels and systemizing notions of questioning, as is expected in education generally, both as teachers and as students. As important as Bloom's work is on slide 5, which is the core nature of questions to critical thinking. And again, I haven't got time here to explain these in depth. Sadly, it's work that I used to do in England. I used to teach critical thinking. It's something I'm fascinated by because it really is, in the end, a taught skill. But there's a series of questions there on the graphic that each, within their own right, demand answers that help you understand a topic or a subject and so on. And critical thinking, I think personally, has been one of the best things that I got out of my first degree. Having the ability to look at and examine arguments or ideas, theories, etc., and come to a point through an evaluation of those things that satisfied me, that was plausible in an academic sense, and that I could present in that way. At a far more mundane level, if you look on slide 6, is the key questions for the reliability test that we did in week 4 of this particular unit, and I think those are fundamental to any student who is having to use sources to justify or support their arguments and their opinion. And I guess I also felt a bit gratuitous by putting them back in here, but I guess if nothing else, it's an extension of the idea of questions and questioning and why we ask them. And these are obviously linked to critical thinking skills. Beyond the quotes on slide 7, and really that's just an interlude before we go into an activity, is the activity itself. A day in the park, or day at the park, sorry, I do apologise. I hope you can use the link. There's a link which, I must confess, it looks much better online, so I would try that first. However, there is a resource that I've put together from the actual cartoon strip that is a hard copy thing that you can print out if you want to, but like I said, I recommend that you look at it online. It's a much better format. However, the most important thing is the questions that follow. So the questions on slide 9, I guess, are an attempt to engage, or get you guys to engage, in what's being said in the comic strip, because it actually is a serious comic strip. It's actually asking some very interesting, and I would say academically orientated questions about the nature of questioning and about the answers that we often have, and that sometimes, as I've asked in question 2, sometimes may become a little boring or static. I'm kind of intrigued by this process because I have been in several situations where it's deemed to be, as I've stated in question 3, radical to ask questions. Not necessarily in academia. I think you can generally get away with that depending on the nature of the question, but certainly in more parochial audiences, when you're asking questions that challenge people's ideas, you get seen to be a radical or sometimes be a mischief maker or a nuisance, troublemaker, etc. It is intriguing. And several things, several labels have been levelled at me in that notion. Some of the questions I've asked, I suppose for me, number 6 and 7 are probably the most interesting in terms of discussing. I'm not necessarily asking you a question, but I want you to think about what comes from those statements. And the last one particularly, I'm interested in, because I think really we do often shackle ourselves to states of mind which are obviously related to and connected with the answers that we have for certain things, that really do hinder our progress in terms of asking further questions and maybe exploring even notions of freedom, to use that word again, notions, that we kind of, I guess, endeavour to have answers that satisfy our daily routines, I guess, and they justify our routines. But what happens if we step outside of those and start to ask bigger questions like, why am I doing this? To what ends? What purpose? Etc. Why do other people do this? And those questions can be, and certainly the answers to them, can be incredibly unsettling. And even during my studies, I had a real crisis in my second year of my first degree, asking those very questions. Why am I doing this? To what ends? What purpose? How does this help me? How does it help other people? And the reason I asked that is that there was so much going on in my life at the time that was beyond my studies, and that probably I could argue had more interest to me than my studies at different times. I waxed and waned in terms of my interest in depending on the units that I was doing, but the intrinsic question didn't go away. I was kind of, what is education? What is learning? Why am I learning these things? And sometimes there was fairly unsatisfactory answers, and I struggled with that, really struggled with that, and had to grapple for the best part of 6 months, I think, to kind of come out of it, and realising that it was okay not to have answers to all the questions that I had, but also that it was okay to have doubts about what I had, because that was part of the unsettling thing, having doubts. And even to this day, becoming an educator, I'm sort of ambivalent, to say the least, about education and about learning and about how it proceeded, particularly in high schools and college level. And I did have lots of questions, and that ambivalence has been carried right through. At times I find it almost quite undermining in terms of my own perceptions of what I am as an educator. And I take a very postmodern, almost satirical look at myself. It's almost a parody of self in many ways, that I'm in the position I'm in. I'm not quite sure how I got here, even though I've done all of the things that were meant to get me here, if that makes sense. Anyway, I won't ramble on about my personal kind of musings. Beyond beyond that activity, we look at the Sokol affair, and I bring this to note really as a way of examining how academia sets up systems. It has systems. It's an enterprise, as such. Sets up systems, and some of those systems are either not challenged, or they're kind of, I guess, explored to some extent by other academics. But in terms of the Sokol affair, here was a man who decided to actually challenge. So Alan Sokal challenged the system and basically wrote a fairly gibberish article in 1994, and in an attempt to get it published and see whether he could get it published. Now, coming from hard sciences, he decided that he'd try and get his paper published in a soft science, as they say. I think that's a pejorative term and not necessarily correct. Get his article published. And it was a deliberate act. So it was a conscious, deceitful act to actually see whether he could get an article that was gibberish published in a humanities journal. And he did. He got it published. There's a series of questions on 12, whether this was ethical or not. I think there's a lot of questions here whether it was. There's a lot of material. Other academics have literally weighed in with their opinions about what Sokal did. And I'll let you wade through those questions and through the affair itself. And I think it's, like I said, an interesting example of where someone has asked the question, and his question simply was, could he get this article published? And he was trying to challenge, and he believed and questioned the fact that his reputation was probably enough to get an article published, and that's what he was relying on, using language that suited the publishers, and also, like I said, the fact that he had credentials. So he was questioning the whole process, in a sense, by enacting this hoax. Moving on to the last part of the lecture, and it's a fairly short lecture this week, I examine what I find quite difficult to believe, but it's an interesting event within itself, is the whole question around foxes in Tasmania, and whether there has ever been and is proven cases that foxes exist in Tasmania. Have a look at the news report that was on the ABC. I've put a link there on slide 14. Certainly watch that. We'll be watching it in class. However, the nub of the exercise really is on 15. And I want you to read through that, and with any luck, you'll concentrate on the middle part of that question, which simply says what questions need to be answered. So if you examine the sources, and you can see that, there's a the sources for lecture activity that's put in to the Milo. I want you to read through those if you can and see what you think about whether the money's been well spent. So it's upwards of 50 million on the eradication program. Now, given the threat, I think it certainly was justified in the early days. There were some spurious reports put out about foxes being released, etc., that were never proven, and you can go through some of the websites that are connected with this, particularly the scientific team, the independent scientific team who looked into and investigated the findings that were taken to justify the 50 million being spent. I would be intrigued to see what you guys come up with and what you think about this, because there's a lot of different ideas and debates about this. But according to the independent report, no credible evidence has been found, certainly not in the last 2 years, which raises a lot of questions. And you have to bear in mind, as I've put on the slide, the fox eradication program was suspended as of June 2012, and that was a recommendation from the government and presumably from the independent report. And that's because no evidence was found, no carcasses, etc. And scats, there's a whole kind of raft of information about the findings of different scats in different parts of the state. Anyway, like I said, if you could literally, think about some of the questions, some of the things you'd like to know or find out that would actually justify whether it should be reintroduced or whether it should be fully closed down, because they are continuing but in a slightly different vein with obviously a lot less resources. Slide 16, of course, is just a parody of what's happened. Maybe I'm being a little bit naughty, a bit scurrilous by putting it in, but I think it's quite fitting. I should say that from my perspective, the government had to do something about it. If any of these stories had been true and nothing had been done, and we'd had devastation in terms of the natural environment and certainly the smaller mammals around the state, then I presume there would have been a metaphoric lynching of any Tasmanian government that had been in at the time and that had rejected or ignored information relating to foxes. So I think they were caught between a rock and a hard place, to be honest. Anyway, I hope you have a great week. This is a fairly short week, as next week will be. Have a good week and enjoy doing your project. Like I said, it's the finale. Make it a good one. Thanks. See you next week.